Captain Desmond Corvin, a man whose 10 years in closed sector analysis had honed his nerves into something resilient and cold, stood at the precipice of a silence that defied understanding. The location, deep in the scorched ochre of the Colorado canyons, was where federal boundaries did not just meet. They vanished. The sun was harsh, a brutal yellow hammer beating down on the granite, baking the air until it felt thin and brittle. But at the entrance to the sealed complex, known only as Sierra Black, the air shifted. It became viscous, heavy, and held a cold metallic tang that tasted like winter and old iron. Corvin adjusted the strap of his rifle. His heavy-duty boots crunched across a thin layer of wind-blown dust and pulverized cement. The compound was tucked into the side of a massive mesa, shielded from aerial view by a sheer overhang that kept the immediate entrance in perpetual shadow. They had arrived to reopen a site frozen 15 years prior, a relic of research the Department of Defense had mandated for historical evaluation. What troubled Corvin was not the lack of perimeter security. That was standard for a deep-cover isolation chamber. What gnawed at him was the perfect unnatural stillness. A canyon, even a dry one, was never truly silent. There was no whine of the high desert wind, no distant rattle of scree, no sound of insects cooking in the heat. Here, there was nothing. The dry, whispering air did not move. It was a silence that swallowed sound, a dead zone where the physics of acoustics paused. The external hatch was monumental, foot-thick steel secured by a quintuple steel lock system, overlaid with the unmistakable seal of the United States government, a seal that looked as dry and dusty as a forgotten tombstone. The seals were unbroken. Yet when the engineering team, analyst Jenna among them, ran the sophisticated electronic scanners over the locking mechanism, the results flashed red with impossibility. The external hardware was bolted shut, but the internal electronic and magnetic fail-safes were entirely depowered and critically unlocked. It was not breached, Captain. Jenna's voice crackled through the communication system, sounding small and shaky in the vast emptiness. It was opened. Someone used the exact sequence to bypass the power-up matrix. No forced entry. No explosives. Someone had carefully navigated the engineering protocols, knowing which copper wire to cut and which buffer to spike. That knowledge pointed away from a casual scavenger or terrorist. It pointed toward institutional knowledge or a very smart occupant. The descent was unnerving, a deliberate 10-minute drop on the auxiliary emergency lift, down through hundreds of feet of solid, unforgiving granite. The pressure change pinched Corvin's eardrums, and he chewed slowly, trying to equalize the oppressive weight above them. The lift car smelled of ozone and damp, oxidized copper. It shuddered, protesting 15 years of dormancy, a metal beast waking up in the darkness. Corvin's powerful headlamp, a blinding white spear in the gloom, showed the walls of the access shaft were coated not in dust, but in a thick, oily perspiration, glistening darkly. This residue covered the access shaft, a sign of recent industrial friction, not a sealed bunker in the desert. When the lift finally settled with a clang deep in the earth, the darkness was absolute. They were standing in the main monitoring block. Electricity was non-existent, except for the weak, intermittent pulse of their specialized power packs. The team moved cautiously, their boots echoing in the wide, empty corridors that smelled overwhelmingly of bleach and old solder. It was Jenna, connecting a diagnostic shunt to the main power nexus, who discovered the residual charge. "Captain, hold up." There is a trickle here, just enough to run the emergency feeds. Someone drew just enough juice to power the emergency systems, then immediately killed the flow. Corvin approached the old cathode ray tube monitors lining the monitoring wall. They were relics, chunky green and black boxes that belonged in a museum. As the residual power flowed into them, the screens flickered to life, hissing like disturbed snakes. The air grew immediately hotter around the banks of ancient vacuum tubes. One monitor, cycling through archived security footage, caught Corvin's attention. The images were ragged, played back with a cyclical stutter and delay. At first it was mundane. People in white lab coats, bustling efficiently, looking tired under the fluorescent light. Then the scene shifted to internal patient observation cells. The subjects in the cells moved differently. They moved with a jerky, too-fast efficiency, a blurring of limbs that defied natural speed. They looked agitated, confined, and deeply distressed. The footage was grainy, but the terror was palpable, even 15 years later, and the sound. On the archived footage, just like in the corridor where they now stood, there was only a chilling, absolute silence. No screams, no panic alarms, just the visual record of accelerated motion happening in a sound vacuum. Corvin leaned in, his cheek resting momentarily on the cool glass of a deactivated status screen. An insidious cold seeped into him, a cold that had nothing to do with the bunker's 65-degree ambient temperature. He moved to the main stainless steel control panel. The console was immense, studded with hundreds of unmarked buttons and levers. Corvin slowly ran his gloved hand across the surface, expecting the cool, inert steel of deep storage. The panel was warm. Not the warmth of latent electricity, but the undeniable, lingering warmth of residual human contact. A living, breathing human being had stood here, operating this machinery only hours ago. A sudden, clammy sheet of sweat broke out on Corvin's back, plastering his shirt to his spine. The analytical chill he usually relied upon evaporated, replaced by the primitive, electric prickle of dread. This was not a mothballed facility. This was an active, recently occupied space. Someone had walked into this subterranean labyrinth, reactivated its systems, and then, judging by the opened inner locks and the activated logs, prepared it for new guests. "Jenna," Corvin said, his voice quiet, devoid of the usual command inflection. It was the voice of a man talking himself through a sudden, shocking realization. "Get the long-range sensor package deployed now. Tighten the perimeter." He knew, even as the order left his lips, that the concept of a perimeter was laughable. They were hundreds of feet under the earth, encased in concrete and steel. The threat was inside, and the perimeter was useless. They were standing in the belly of the beast, and the beast had just ingested them. The team, reduced now to 4 souls moving with sickening caution, began their deep dive into the administrative sector. The corridors here were slightly cleaner, lined with steel shelving that held stacks of moldering paper documentation untouched for a decade and a half. Corvin stationed 2 men, technicians with heavy-duty thermal and motion sensors at the entrance to the sector, then followed Jenna into the server room. The air here was drier, crackling faintly with static electricity generated by the miraculously preserved but clearly antiquated server banks. Dust motes danced in the focused cones of their headlamps, spinning above banks of humming machines that sounded like oversized refrigerators struggling through a desert heat wave. Jenna, her movements quick and efficient despite the escalating dread, hot-wired a console, bypassing the security encryption using a decade-old backdoor protocol known only to Corvin's section. The screen flared, showing the first concrete evidence of the darkness they had walked into. Project Gargoyle 12. The name was displayed in block, official lettering, stark white against a blue security screen. The documents revealed the scale. This was not mere medical research. It was a deeply sanctioned program aimed at altering human genetics to forge the ultimate, disposable operative. It was medical sadism cloaked in national security. They clicked deeper into the file structures, the cursor moving through layers of code and classified reports. The first branch detailed the Canis line. The files described subjects, mostly military volunteers, receiving rapid phenotypic changes. Their goal was sheer brute force. Subjects gained phenomenal muscular density, skeletal alterations, especially around the rib cage and shoulders, and a chilling capacity for nocturnal vision. The resulting creatures were bipedal predators, capable of absorbing extensive damage and continuing the fight. The trade-off, noted in a clinical report, was severe. Their minds were simplified, driven almost entirely by the instinct of territorial rage and the primal urge to feed. Jenna navigated to the second, more subtle set of files, Lupus Line. This branch, Corvin noted with a shiver, was designed for elegance. The emphasis was on speed, concealment, and hyperacuity in their sensory systems. They were faster than their Canis counterparts, though more fragile, focused on ambush tactics and the quick, clean tear to the throat. They were the refined, elegant version of terror. The subjects in the cells moved differently. They moved with a jerky, too-fast efficiency, a blurring of limbs that defied natural speed. They looked agitated, confined, and deeply distressed. The footage was grainy, but the terror was palpable, even 15 years later, and the sound. On the archived footage, just like in the corridor where they now stood, there was only a chilling, absolute silence. No screams, no panic alarms, just the visual record of accelerated motion happening in a sound vacuum. Corvin leaned in, his cheek resting momentarily on the cool glass of a deactivated status screen. An insidious cold seeped into him, a cold that had nothing to do with the bunker's 65-degree ambient temperature. He moved to the main stainless steel control panel. The console was immense, studded with hundreds of unmarked buttons and levers. Corvin slowly ran his gloved hand across the surface, expecting the cool, inert steel of deep storage. The panel was warm. Not the warmth of latent electricity, but the undeniable, lingering warmth of residual human contact. A living, breathing human being had stood here, operating this machinery only hours ago. A sudden, clammy sheet of sweat broke out on Corvin's back, plastering his shirt to his spine. The analytical chill he usually relied upon evaporated, replaced by the primitive, electric prickle of dread. This was not a mothballed facility. This was an active, recently occupied space. Someone had walked into this subterranean labyrinth, reactivated its systems, and then, judging by the opened inner locks and the activated logs, prepared it for new guests. "Jenna," Corvin said, his voice quiet, devoid of the usual command inflection. It was the voice of a man talking himself through a sudden, shocking realization. "Get the long-range sensor package deployed now. Tighten the perimeter." He knew, even as the order left his lips, that the concept of a perimeter was laughable. They were hundreds of feet under the earth, encased in concrete and steel. The threat was inside, and the perimeter was useless. They were standing in the belly of the beast, and the beast had just ingested them. The team, reduced now to 4 souls moving with sickening caution, began their deep dive into the administrative sector. The corridors here were slightly cleaner, lined with steel shelving that held stacks of moldering paper documentation untouched for a decade and a half. Corvin stationed 2 men, technicians with heavy-duty thermal and motion sensors at the entrance to the sector, then followed Jenna into the server room. The air here was drier, crackling faintly with static electricity generated by the miraculously preserved but clearly antiquated server banks. Dust motes danced in the focused cones of their headlamps, spinning above banks of humming machines that sounded like oversized refrigerators struggling through a desert heat wave. Jenna, her movements quick and efficient despite the escalating dread, hot-wired a console, bypassing the security encryption using a decade-old backdoor protocol known only to Corvin's section. The screen flared, showing the first concrete evidence of the darkness they had walked into. Project Gargoyle 12. The name was displayed in block, official lettering, stark white against a blue security screen. The documents revealed the scale. This was not mere medical research. It was a deeply sanctioned program aimed at altering human genetics to forge the ultimate, disposable operative. It was medical sadism cloaked in national security. They clicked deeper into the file structures, the cursor moving through layers of code and classified reports. The first branch detailed the Canis line. The files described subjects, mostly military volunteers, receiving rapid phenotypic changes. Their goal was sheer brute force. Subjects gained phenomenal muscular density, skeletal alterations, especially around the rib cage and shoulders, and a chilling capacity for nocturnal vision. The resulting creatures were bipedal predators, capable of absorbing extensive damage and continuing the fight. The trade-off, noted in a clinical report, was severe. Their minds were simplified, driven almost entirely by the instinct of territorial rage and the primal urge to feed. Jenna navigated to the second, more subtle set of files, Lupus Line. This branch, Corvin noted with a shiver, was designed for elegance. The emphasis was on speed, concealment, and hyperacuity in their sensory systems. They were faster than their Canis counterparts, though more fragile, focused on ambush tactics and the quick, clean tear to the throat. They were the refined, elegant version of terror. A central summary report, highlighted in glaring electronic red, provided the ultimate conclusion, the project's fatal flaw. Psychological stability remains unattainable. Within 110 days post-full transformation, the subject invariably begins to regard non-modified humans as prey, regardless of prior conditioning, emotional bonds, or military discipline. The beast always won. As the data flooded their screens, detailing the unspeakable procedures performed hundreds of feet beneath the earth, a sharp, aggressive stench began to permeate the server room. It was not the scent of mildew or decay common to long-abandoned places. This was a raw, undeniably animal aroma, overlaid with a strong, metallic, coppery note. It was the heavy, musky smell of wet fur combined with the sharp chemical odor of fresh blood. The odor emanated from the place itself, a residue of intense animalistic occupation. Corvin, moving away from the humming servers, scanned the floor with his lamp. The industrial linoleum was scuffed and dusty, but under one of the old, overturned steel desks, Corvin found them, deep, parallel score marks etched into the flooring. They were perfectly straight, wide grooves, too profound for a heavy boot or a careless piece of equipment. He crouched, tracing the marks with the tip of his gloved finger. They were the definite trail of 5 digits, ending in points that were the length of a human index finger. Claws. Not the curved, delicate points of a feline, but thick, aggressive hooks capable of gouging cement. They suggested a hand structure unnervingly similar to a human's, but weaponized beyond comprehension. Jenna, meanwhile, scrutinized the deep-level engineering schematics, the blueprints of the bunker's original construction and the subsequent modifications. She whistled softly, a sound instantly swallowed by the heavy air. "Captain, look at this. Research bays A3, A4, and A5. The deepest containment zones, where the most advanced prototypes were kept." She pointed a thin finger at a pulsing red schematic on the screen. They were not isolated by standard procedure. They were sealed from the inside. Corvin leaned closer. The original design called for external activation of the magnetic containment seals. But these 3 bays showed a unique failsafe, an internal lever that only staff physically present within those specific deep sections could pull. "Someone trapped themselves in, Captain, after they locked the creatures away," Jenna summarized. "And they did it recently enough that the system logged the emergency lockdown before the power drain. It was not an evacuation. It was a sacrifice play." Corvin felt the dread solidify in his gut. The sacrifice had failed. The exterior of the complex had been opened, the internal systems recently activated, and the warm steel of the control panel confirmed that whoever had been here last was not the person who sealed themselves in. It meant that whatever was sealed in had somehow found a way out, or had been intentionally freed. He stood up, brushing the clinging dust from his pants. The metallic, wet fur smell was stronger now, a constant pressure on his sinuses. They were tracking specters, but specters with sharp claws and the scent of the wild. He knew with sudden certainty that the team who had sealed themselves inside those bays 15 years ago did not intend to return to the world. They were hoping to take the secret and the horror with them. The fact that their prison now stood open meant their final terrible choice was utterly negated. Following the faint residual power lines indicated by Jenna's analysis, Corvin led the team into the zone dedicated to medical observation and psychological assessment. This sector was tighter, the corridors segmented by heavy, reinforced steel doors. They moved through narrow examination rooms, past empty stainless steel gurneys, until they reached a solitary, deep containment cell. According to the fragmented files they retrieved, this chamber was reserved for stable early-phase subjects, those whose transformation was controlled enough for ongoing human interaction. Corvin approached the twin layers of armored glass. Behind them, bathed in the weak pulsing light of their lanterns, sat a man. He was the definition of impossible stillness. He sat cross-legged on the steel bench, hands resting calmly on his knees, head slightly inclined. His figure was obscured by the tattered remains of a military uniform, far too large for him now. He did not react to the floodlight, the sound of their boots, or the sudden glare of their intrusion. Corvin watched him, waiting for the natural human tremor, the blink, the slight shift in posture that indicated awareness. It did not come. The man's face, heavily lined and covered in a week's growth of graying stubble, was utterly devoid of expression. It was the face of a portrait painted from clay. He had not blinked since they arrived. Jenna accessed the digital plaque next to the cell. The data was sparse but clear. Subject identification 742. A former Marine Corps specialist inducted into the first phase of the genetic modifier program. His name, they learned, was Jacob Stern. He was officially logged as lost to the project 15 years ago. Corvin activated the communications microphone embedded in the wall, an act that felt profoundly stupid and dangerous. "Mr. Stern? Jacob? We are here to conduct an assessment. We are with the government." The response was instantaneous, dropping the impossible stillness into immediate, chilling motion. Stern's head tilted up an imperceptible fraction of an inch, though his eyes remained fixed on a spot just above Corvin's head. His voice, when it came through the distorted speaker, was flat, modulated, and utterly emotionless, like a poorly synthesized machine. "Leave this place. Now. It is unsafe. You were not meant to come here." The unnatural cadence of the speech was more alarming than his words. It held no inflection, no rise or fall of fear or anger, only pure, informational delivery. Corvin pressed him. "We need to understand what happened here, Jacob. The project files indicated a stability failure due to aggressive instincts." Stern offered a mechanical, cold laugh that did not reach his eyes. Instinct was the easy part, the simple mistake. That was the Canis error. The problem was the second phase, the one they never mastered. He paused, the silence stretching taut. The modifier does not destroy intellect. It amplifies it, enhances cognitive function to levels that cannot be described to an unmodified mind. You gain the body of the predator, but you retain the mind of the planner. The hunter becomes something more, something strategically, terrifyingly effective. As Corvin tried to formulate the next question, the engineering technician accompanying them, attempting to gain access to the cell's internal diagnostics, began manipulating the manual locking mechanism. The moment the tumbler whirred, attempting to find the key code, Stern's absolute control began to crack. On his neck and hands, where the skin was thinnest, dark, dense lines began to pulse beneath the surface. They looked like rough internal stitching, or perhaps subsurface veins swollen to bursting point. His powerful musculature beneath the tattered uniform began to twitch, a rapid internal vibration, like an exposed nerve firing erratically. "Stop that!" Stern hissed, his voice momentarily dropping the synthetic flatness, replaced by a ragged undertone that sounded like grinding teeth. "Do not engage the door mechanism." Corvin ordered the technician to halt. "What are you worried about, Jacob? We are trying to help you." "You are disrupting my control matrix," Stern replied, the synthetic voice returning, strained now. "I am locked in isolation. I sealed myself here. I am trying to keep the signal noise down." He leaned forward slightly, and now his gaze finally met Corvin's. His eyes, previously dull and human, were rapidly shifting. They became suddenly intensely bright, almost luminous white, and the pupil contracted, elongating into a thin, predatory black vertical slit. "Do not open A3, he pleaded, the robotic voice failing entirely, replaced by a raw, desperate human tone. I could not stop them. I blocked myself off so they could not sense my location. But they are back now. They know you are here. This is their nesting ground, not yours." Corvin felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Stern was not just a victim. He was a self-imposed sentinel, holding a fragile line against a horror he understood intimately. The engineer-technician, however, followed protocol, which mandated investigating the deeper levels. He was already preparing a small thermite charge to bypass the magnetic lock and open the adjacent structural access to A3. The sight of the sizzling charge preparation finalized the collapse of Jacob Stern's decades-long control. His back arched, forcing a loud, grinding crack from his spine. His luminous eyes locked onto Corvin's. He no longer pleaded or warned. He issued a command, sharp and terrifyingly clear, yet still delivered without the warmth of a human voice. "You must run. Now." The sound that followed was a wet, sickening pop, as the skin on his neck failed to contain the pressure, revealing those dark, dense lines beneath, now visible and writhing. The terror was not in the creature he was becoming, but in the agonizing, silent struggle of the human that still existed within it, desperate for them to survive. The thermite charge against the deep containment access door to A3 delivered a deep, muffled detonation, a sound like an immense force clearing its throat in a granite cave. The corridor shuddered violently, thick dust showering down, mixing with the oily residue on the walls. Corvin ordered the breach team forward, ignoring the faint, sickening sound of grinding bone coming from Stern's cell down the hall. The door buckled open, revealing an absolute, impenetrable blackness. Even the concentrated beams of their helmet lamps struggled to penetrate the void. The air pressure shifted instantly. The oppressive warmth of the inner bunker was replaced by an aggressive, biting cold, a temperature far below normal geothermal insulation, and the air was moving. Not a draft, but a heavy, deliberate movement, a slow, deep, rhythmic expansion and contraction. It felt less like a ventilation current and more like the heavy, wet respiration of something enormous, rooted in the darkness beyond. Inside the bay, which was vast, Corvin's light swept across the remains of the facility's true purpose. He saw two massive containment chambers, built from reinforced steel and concrete. They looked like enormous cylindrical animal cages. The protective viewport of the first chamber, a foot-thick slab of laminated ballistic glass, was ruined. It was covered in long, sickening radial cracks, emanating from several distinct central impact points, showing that something infinitely strong had pushed methodically from inside. The second chamber displayed the same pattern of destruction. The material had yielded to internal pressure. The sight amplified the dread. Whatever had been sealed in here had not been blasted out. It had simply decided to leave. Corvin moved cautiously across the concrete floor, now littered with debris, pulverized glass, and shredded high-density acoustic foam. He looked for signs, for tracks, and he found them, mingled with the older, dust-covered marks. These prints were fresh. They were the enormous five-toed paw prints they had seen in the administrative sector, but these were pressed deeper, indicating extreme mass and recent motion. They led away from the breach, deeper into the complex, confirming the escape. What truly paralyzed Corvin was the secondary set of prints. After leading out, the tracks in several places had circled back. The massive footprints returned to their respective empty cages, walking right up to the broken glass, pausing, and then departing again. "They came back," Corvin whispered, the sound dead in the air. They did not just run. They returned to their point of origin. It was a deliberate action, suggesting not a panicked flight, but a planned departure, or perhaps a check-in before the hunt began. Jenna's breath hitched over the communications system. She was setting up the portable diagnostics unit near the wreckage. "Captain, the files here confirm the specifications for these prototypes. They were the ideal hybrids, the mass of the Canis line, but the elongated, almost articulated limbs of the Lupus line. They were built to cut steel, and they were fitted with primitive cerebral implants designed to link them to the main controlling server." Corvin felt the implication like a physical blow. These creatures were not meant to be free-roaming wildlife. They were remotely manageable military assets. Suddenly, the dusty, archaic console next to Jenna shuddered and flared to life. Not green this time, but an alarming, insistent red. A simple log appeared on the screen, detailing the final commands issued to the containment facility. The text was simple and brutal. Protocol activation R42. Launch sequence initiated. Time stamp. 48 hours, 11 minutes ago. 48 hours, Corvin muttered. That was when the silence had begun, when the facility was deliberately powered back up. Jenna's hands flew over the controls, trying to backtrack the signal origin of Protocol R42. The system resisted, throwing up walls of encryption, but she was good. Within a harrowing minute, the source Internet Protocol address resolved onto the screen. It was not an internal switch. It was not a remote access point near the canyon. The address traced back directly to an active, secure, centralized server cluster maintained by the highest echelons of Corvin's own agency. Corvin stared at the bright, unambiguous Internet Protocol address. The cold truth of betrayal settled in his lungs, heavier than the granite above them. This was not an incident, an escape, or a containment failure. His team was not sent here to check on a closed facility. They were sent here as live fire measurements. Someone sitting comfortably behind a desk thousands of miles away had purposefully activated the most devastating, evolutionarily advanced apex predators the project had created. And they had done so 48 hours before Corvin's team arrived, ensuring the creatures were fully awake, fully integrated into their surroundings, and primed to react to the introduction of fresh human targets. "We are bait, Jenna," Corvin said, the conversational ease of his tone contrasting sharply with the terrifying weight of the realization. "They are testing the speed of the response. We are not here for assessment. We are here for data collection." The heavy mechanical breathing from the depths of the bay intensified, now that the lights were on and the logs were exposed. They were no longer investigators. They were targets in a highly controlled subterranean experiment. Corvin pulled the remaining team members back toward the central command point, the realization of their engineered fate adding a suffocating urgency to their movements. The retreat was not about safety. It was about proximity to the few communication systems that might punch through the granite ceiling. He tried to raise their handlers, to report the breach and the undeniable evidence of betrayal, but the radio channels were dead. Not just static or severed. They were filled with a constant, oppressive, low-frequency hum. It was a dense, vibrating sound that resonated through the soles of their boots, up their legs, and into the marrow of their bones. It was a massive, deliberate acoustic barrier established by sophisticated electronic countermeasures and activated right alongside the R42 protocol. The atmosphere was changing again. The initial dread of the unknown had morphed into the acute, harrowing conviction of being watched. The sensory terror began in the poorly lit corridors leading back to the administrative area. In the deep shadows, just beyond the reach of their powerful lamps, quick glints of light appeared. 2, sometimes 3, pairs of luminous points, low to the ground. They were gone in a heartbeat the moment Corvin aimed his beam at the spot. The hunters were not hiding. They were engaging in a predatory game, flaunting their superior vision and speed. "They are playing with us," Jenna whispered, clutching her rifle tightly. "They know exactly where we are, and they are assessing the path of least resistance." Corvin turned back to the remaining operational screen, poring over the current directives loaded into the system by the unnamed external party, the Alpha Hunter. The truth of the operation was revealed in stark military language. The current leadership had not just resumed the project, they had refined it. The goal was no longer merely enhanced soldiers. The directives spoke of the final synthesis and reverse engineering. The Alpha Hunter's objective was twofold. First, test the adaptability and strategic range of the newly awakened perfected variants in a hostile environment. Second, capture fresh, live human samples for a process of back transformation. The horrifying motive was clear. They wanted to understand how to reintroduce the human consciousness into the modified body, creating soldiers who could toggle the switch between human reason and optimized predatory fury. They were creating the perfect self-aware strategic weapon. As the creatures drew closer, tracking their movement through the dense granite, the scent intensified beyond mere musky sharpness. The smell of copper and blood became so pungent and acrid that it physically stung Corvin's eyes. He felt the taste of it on his tongue, a bitter chemical flavor that reminded him of old pennies and high-octane fuel. Then came the sound from the ventilation system. The massive ducts, crisscrossing the entire complex like steel arteries, had begun to act as sound channels. From them emanated not the mindless, panicked snarl of an animal, but a low, gurgling, throaty resonance. It sounded like an intense, strained effort at speech, human language, attempting to form syllables through a throat and vocal cord structure that was physically incapable of the task. "They are communicating," Corvin realized, his voice husky. "They are using the system to talk to each other, or maybe to us." The gurgling sounds coalesced into something that resonated like a mockery of human conversation, full of clicks and unnatural sibilance. It spoke of organization, not chaos. Corvin felt the profound, chilling weight of their situation. They were attempting to elude a new, advanced form of military intelligence, a force created, sanctioned, and released by the very government they served. This complex was not a forgotten bunker. It was an incubator, and they were the first test subjects to measure the success of the resulting lethal brood. The true horror was not the physical threat, but the intellectual realization that the very nature of warfare had irrevocably shifted beneath their feet. They were up against perfect malice, combined with perfect strategy. The tightening pressure of the hunt forced Corvin and his remaining 2 teammates, Jenna and a silent, terrified technician, to seek a temporary refuge and perhaps final information back at Jacob Stern's containment cell. Time had passed quickly in the terrifying darkness, and the brief window of opportunity Stern had warned them about was rapidly closing. They found Stern standing, leaning heavily against the armored glass. His transformation was nearing completion. His old uniform hung from a body that had thickened and elongated unnaturally. His muscles beneath the cloth were ropey and tense. The unnatural stillness was gone, replaced by a constant, agonizing internal tremor. "You came back," Stern rasped, the synthetic quality now completely replaced by a tearing, wet sound. "I did not think you would survive the central approach." His face was profoundly distorted. The nose was flattened, the jawline stretched forward into a more predatory muzzle shape. But the forehead retained a disturbing semblance of human high intellect. He was a horrific, agonizing blend. Corvin cut straight to the need. "How do they find us?" "The sensors are useless." Stern coughed, a sound thick with fluid and rage. "The collective impulse. I was never just an individual subject. I was integrated into the core network of Gargoyle 12. All the initial prototypes, and certainly the unified variant, are linked. When one experiences a burst of extreme instinct, a flash of hunger, or territorial fury, that impulse vibrates through the rock, through the neural network." He looked directly at Corvin, the vertical white slits of his eyes blazing. "When you entered, your presence created a low-frequency disturbance. They did not smell you, Captain. They felt your life. A high-energy anomaly in the stone, a vibration that carried through hundreds of feet of granite and steel. This was the source of the bone-shaking hum Corvin felt, the frequency of the creature's existence, their awareness. The greatest horror," Stern continued, his voice barely a coherent whisper, "is that they do not need the external commands anymore. They adapt, Corvin. They learned how to read our internal documents. They learned how the chain of command works. The hierarchy embedded in their original instinct has naturally reformed now that they have cognitive function. The smartest, the strongest, the one that tore open A3, is now the dominant leader. They are thinking collective hunters." Stern's internal struggle was now visible, a grotesque dance of conflicting biology. He described the dual existence, the sharp, planning human consciousness, weak but rational, and the pure, overwhelming instinct of the beast, powerful but strategically blind. The unified variant achieved its namesake by fusing these two, creating an entity that stalked with instinct but planned with the cold precision of an analyst. "You need to leave," Stern commanded, his body trembling violently. "Now." He pointed a rapidly changing hand, the knuckles swelling, the nails elongating into hard, dark points, toward a maintenance diagram etched near the floor. "This facility has a hidden tertiary evacuation route. An old drainage overflow shaft running nearly vertical to the canyon shelf above. Only early security staff knew about it." He explained the sequence. A manual override on the old utility panel nearby, followed by an immediate physical descent. It was a miserable, tight crawl, but it was their only chance for an unobstructed path. As he spoke, his transformation accelerated at a terrifying rate. The skin on his face seemed to tighten over his elongating skull structure, stretched thin, like plastic wrap pulled taut. He had held 15 years of instinctual evolution in check, but the proximity of his fully transformed brethren and the adrenaline of the team's arrival was too much. The mental integrity was collapsing. "I need you to activate the level A3 power dump," Stern insisted, his voice now a desperate plea, thick with a sound of ripping cartilage. "The main emergency breaker. It will cause a brief, total blackout on the lower levels. 5 minutes, maybe less. It will confuse their sensory network." It will buy you time in the shaft." He looked at Corvin, the last vestige of the Marine's humanity fighting a losing battle. "Go, before I cease to be myself. I can still use my remaining strength to delay them at this point. They see me as a threat, a rogue element. I can draw them here." Corvin nodded, his throat tight with a painful mixture of pity and terror, knowing that Jacob Stern had just chosen to end his path for their benefit. Corvin moved the team swiftly toward the utility access door leading to the old drain shaft, the last words of Jacob Stern echoing in his ears. The heavy, resonating sound of the hunters was growing louder, moving with unnatural speed through the deep corridors, drawn now by the concentrated fear and the disruption caused by Stern's rapidly deteriorating control. The hunt was clearly underway, but it was not the senseless rampage of panicked animals. It was a terrifying display of tactical, surgical intelligence. As they entered Section E5, a long, narrow service corridor, they found their first obstacle. Every possible turn-off, every junction that might have offered an alternate route, was blocked. Heavy industrial steel boxes, storage containers weighing hundreds of pounds, had been neatly stacked, creating impregnable barricades. The creatures had deliberately funneled the team toward the single viable exit, the drain shaft entrance. They had preemptively engineered the environment. Corvin cursed softly. "They are building a maze," he said. "They are controlling our movement." Then the lights began to fail. It was not a general power outage. The fluorescent tubes sputtered and died with sickening precision, sequentially. First in the corridor behind them, then, seconds later, in the corridor immediately ahead. They were isolated in a narrow, moving cone of light cast by their lamps, creating tunnel vision and maximizing their reliance on sound, which was the creature's primary weapon. The sound of claws on concrete was horrifying. Corvin first heard the quiet skak, skak, skak of sharp points being polished against the industrial floor, a sound of anticipation. Then it escalated into a distinct rhythmic thump, thump, thump. They were moving primarily on four limbs, covering ground with the explosive speed of large canids. But then, frequently, the sound would shift to a heavy bipedal footfall, confirming they stood upright to survey and calculate. The change in gait sounded less like an animal and more like a mechanical malfunction, unsettling and unpredictable. The creatures were not relying on physical ambush yet. They were performing reconnaissance. They were using the massive steel ventilation shafts not just for communication, but for stealthy observation. Corvin saw a dark, muscular shape briefly protrude from a ceiling vent, a head that was too large and too fast, assessing the composition of the group before vanishing instantly, soundlessly. They were tactical snipers utilizing the complex's infrastructure against its human architects. The psychological attacks followed swiftly. From the deep recesses of the complex, noises began to echo through the shafts and hallways, sounds designed to disrupt cohesion. Corvin heard the sharp, unmistakable retort of a shotgun firing into drywall. Then, moments later, a short, choked human scream, horribly convincing. They were testing the team's reaction to fabricated distress and potential disinformation. The terror culminated near the junction box they needed to reach. Jenna, walking tail position, suddenly froze, dropping her rifle. Her hand flew to her throat, and she let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward into the technician. "Air," she choked out, her eyes wide and wet. "Hot air, right in my face, sticky, smelled like rotten meat. Corvin aimed his light instantly. Above her was a steel ventilation grating, rusted but intact. Nothing could have physically forced air through that sealed grill. It was a sensory trick, a localized burst of heat and scent pumped through the system, a deliberate, focused warning. They had been given enough time to recognize their fate, and now the rules of the game changed. Corvin was struggling with the heavy manual lock on the utility door when the technician, a young man named Phil, screamed not in terror, but in abrupt, stunning shock. Corvin spun around. He saw only a brief, dark brown silhouette moving with impossible speed, too low, too fast, a flash of muscle and bone. Phil was enveloped in a terrifying, silent embrace. There was a single, high-pitched crack, like a dry branch snapping underfoot. And then, terrifyingly, nothing. No spray of blood. No prolonged struggle. Just the sudden, stunning removal of a human life. When Corvin's lamp beam steadied, the space where Phil had stood was empty. The elimination was clean, efficient, and complete. The creature did not survive the night. The utter silence that followed the removal was far worse than the noise of the struggle. It confirmed that they were not dealing with animals that needed to feed. They were dealing with assassins focused on operational efficiency. Corvin pushed Jenna toward the door, throwing himself at the locking mechanism. They had less than a minute before the calculated silence turned into a full-scale ambush. Driven by the shocking efficiency of their enemy, Corvin and Jenna stumbled through the newly opened maintenance door and into a compact, specialized server station, the true computational heart of Sierra Black. This area was humming, brightly lit by modern light-emitting diode indicators, which somehow survived the power fluctuations. It was here, among the blinking, humming cabinets, that the final, most ambitious goal of Project Gargoyle 12 was laid bare. Corvin, pushing past the initial wave of exhaustion, pulled a data chip from a smoking diagnostics port and slotted it into his field laptop. The first document that appeared was titled, "With Chilling Finality, Finale, Unified Variant." The document confirmed Stern's fragmented warnings. The purpose of the project was never the imperfect Canis or the fragile lupus lines. The ultimate overarching goal was synthesis, the unified variant. This perfect type was designed to combine the massive resilience and dense musculature of the Canis, the stealth and blinding speed of the lupus, while maintaining critically complete cognitive function. The goal was not a soldier who followed orders. It was a soldier who created orders. An independent strategic commander housed in an indestructible apex predator body. A perfect weapon that required no human oversight. The realization that they were being hunted by the ultimate self-developing killing machine sent a fresh wave of panic through Corvin. The files indicated that the entities hunting them were not mere prototypes. They were the first instances of a self-evolving unified variant, entities that had spent 15 years in deep isolation, constantly honing their mental and physical acuity. Jacob Stern had been a learning tool, a constant, irritating human presence that the creatures had been forced to mentally navigate. The recordings detailed the plan of the Alpha Hunter, the anonymous high-level commander who had reopened the site. The goal was clearly stated. They were not trying to recapture the variants. The escape was mandatory. The final test, the culmination of the project, was to observe the creature's adaptability, communication, and capacity for self-propagation in the real world. Their current lethal game was merely the final exam. A sudden, sharp series of beeps issued from the main control terminal. They had been discovered. The protocol for facility lockdown had been initiated, not to protect Corvin's team, but to seal the external access points, ensuring the unified variants had only one way out, through the drainage shaft and onto the canyon face, thereby launching them into the wider environment. Corvin forced himself to look at the monitor nearest him, which displayed a feed from a salvaged corridor camera just outside the server station. The creature stopped in the faint, residual light spilling from the server room door. It stood on two legs, but its height was unnatural, its limbs far too elongated for a man, yet terrifyingly articulate. Its body was dense, covered in short, thick, mottled brown and gray fur, but its head was the most monstrous aspect. It retained the definite shape of a human skull, stretched over a powerful, elongated muzzle filled with teeth that Corvin dared not imagine. It was not acting like an animal. It was demonstrating. The creature lowered its head slowly, picking up a ballistic vest dropped earlier by Phil. It held the vest in its clawed hands, turning it over, examining the weave and the stitching with a chilling, almost academic curiosity. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that conveyed profound boredom rather than effort, it sank its immense claws into the Kevlar fibers and tore the vest cleanly in two, lengthwise. It dropped the useless scraps onto the floor, its white eyes fixed on the camera lens. It was a display of intellectual malice, not rage. It was showing them through the camera that their best defense was useless, and that it understood the principles of human protection. It had planned the barricades. It was controlling the light. And now it was demonstrating its overwhelming physical superiority. Corvin slammed his laptop shut. They were not fighting a beast. They were fighting a strategy, housed in an evolutionary weapon. The threat was now palpable, an enormous thinking presence just outside the steel door. Corvin and Jenna had to move, and their only option was the route Stern had provided. They ran back toward the medical sector, their feet pounding against the concrete, the metallic scent of the hunter thick in the air. They reached Stern's cell. He was barely recognizable. The transformation was complete. He was a monolithic, terrifying hybrid, massive and coiled with impossible tension. His skin was stretched to its limit, ripped in places where the new bone structure had forced its way through. His breath was a gurgling, wet roar, and his eyes burned with the aggressive, absolute white of the predator. Yet he was waiting for them. "They are here," he ground out. The words squeezed past a throat structure that was now half beast. "They sense me now, fully. They see me as a threat to the hierarchy." Corvin did not hesitate. He rushed to the junction box Stern had indicated, ripped open the panel, and found the emergency trip switch, an enormous, greasy steel lever. "Now, Corvin," Stern roared, his voice splitting between the human and the snarl. Corvin grabbed the lever and threw it down. The facility plunged into absolute, consuming darkness. The sound of the unified variants rushing the corridor was deafening, a thunderous impact against the cell walls, followed by guttural snarls of confusion. The sudden absence of the visual stimulus momentarily throwing off their highly tuned senses. In the total black void, Corvin found the small, camouflaged door to the drainage shaft. He shoved Jenna through, following immediately. Behind them, the terrifying battle began. Stern, finally giving in to the overwhelming power of the transformation, utilized the sheer brute strength that had been suppressed for 15 years. The next 3 minutes were defined by pure primal sound, a cacophony of monstrous roars, mixed with the terrifying rhythmic sound of bone on granite. Steel buckled. The thick armored glass of Stern's cell failed with a sound like a distant cannon. He was not just holding them. He was fighting with a terrifying, self-sacrificial rage. Corvin heard the ripping, tearing noise of metal and sinew, followed by a final, high-pitched scream of agony that was abruptly cut short. Jacob Stern had met his fate, buying them their window. The air in the shaft instantly changed. The wet, claustrophobic atmosphere of the drain tunnel, smelling of chlorine and cold, metallic decay, was replaced by a wave of hot, concentrated stench from the fight. Ozone from the electrical short, the overpowering musk of the creatures, and the sickeningly sweet, heavy scent of freshly spilled blood and scorched fur. Corvin was on his belly, worming his way through the narrow, slime-coated pipe. It was a suffocating, humbling crawl, inches at a time toward a faint, distant point of light. The cold, wet slime coated his face and hands. From the depths of the complex, below where Stern had fallen, the heavy thudding sound of the pursuit continued. But it was slower now, less focused. The drainage shaft, designed only for human maintenance access, was too small for the unified variant's newly increased, massive musculature. The physical specifications that made them perfect killing machines were now a temporary logistical vulnerability. They were trying to find another way up, seeking a larger service access point, momentarily thwarted by the tight confines of the escape route. Corvin pressed on, crawling toward the light, carried forward on the cold current of drain water and the memory of Stern's sacrifice. After an eternity of desperate, filthy crawling, Corvin and Jenna emerged from the drainage shaft. They were hundreds of feet up the canyon wall, concealed on a narrow, precarious terrace covered in fractured rocks and clumps of dry sagebrush. The bright, unforgiving light of the mid-morning sun was a painful shock after hours in the subterranean gloom. The air was clean, dry, and cool, a blessed contrast, but the relief was immediately negated by the knowledge that they were now exposed targets. Corvin, squinting against the glare, ordered Jenna to deploy the satellite uplink, a specialized high-gain antenna disguised as a piece of geological equipment. He did not wait for her to connect. His eyes were fixed on the granite face of the canyon above the entrance to Sierra Black. They knew the creatures could not use the tight drain shaft, but they were now hunting in the natural environment. Then Corvin saw the movement. Far above the terrace, where the canyon wall was almost sheer, he saw the first dark, mottled figure. It was scrambling across the vertical stone. It was not using ropes or equipment. It was using its own biological tools. The movement was shocking. It was not climbing. It was running vertically, using the slightest fissures and imperfections in the granite as handholds and toeholds. The creature's elongated, powerful limbs propelled it up the face with a blurring speed that defied gravity. What would take a seasoned rock climber an hour to navigate, this creature devoured in less than 3 minutes. More figures followed, appearing from different shadowed crevices on the rock face, all converging on the plateau above them. The unified variants had mastered the vertical environment. "They are faster than we thought," Corvin rasped, pulling out the small, restricted band radio. He began transmitting a short, encoded warning about the biological threat, overriding Jenna's initial attempts at formal communication. Even on the wind-swept, high-desert terrace, Corvin felt the sensory marker of the creatures closing in. It was not just smell now. It was a palpable anxiety, an internal alarm triggered by the sheer proximity of such lethal, concentrated power. He realized that the sheer volume of his fear was a broadcast signal, a delicious chemical beacon guiding them to the feast. Jenna, her face pale and streaked with sweat and grime, finally established a voice link. Her voice was thin, ragged with effort as she spoke the crucial code-verified coordinates. "This is Alpha 2 requesting immediate extract. Biohazard situation is uncontrolled. Confirmed systemic breach of containment protocols. Repeat. Requesting immediate hot extraction over." The answer was terse and immediate. A military transport helicopter was en route. Estimated time of arrival 7 minutes. Corvin watched the slope. The first figures were now within clear visibility, perhaps a quarter-mile away, moving with a tireless, undulating motion over the broken scree and dry brush. He saw them clearly in the brutal daylight, not just covered in fur, but with muscles visible as tight, writhing cables of extraordinary strength beneath the hide. They were no longer abstract monsters in the dark. They were solid, terrifyingly real apex predators, closing the distance with calculated speed. Corvin raised his rifle, but the distance was still too great, and the targets moved too quickly. He knew with absolute dread that they would not make it to the helicopter without a confrontation. The silence of the canyon was about to be broken by rotor wash, and the creatures he knew would recognize that sound as both an obstacle and a new strategic resource. The sound of the incoming evacuation helicopter, a military transport aircraft, was a brutal, overwhelming intrusion on the high desert silence. The pilot, ignoring safety protocol in the face of the desperate plea for immediate extraction, brought the massive aircraft in too close, descending rapidly toward the narrow, sloping terrace. Corvin knew the sound was a vulnerability. The sudden noise explosion would disorient the crew, but the unified variants with their honed senses would interpret the roaring engine as a complex target. The creatures did not rush the terrace in a frenzy. They utilized their understanding of trajectory and elevation. As the military transport helicopter dropped its winch line, Corvin saw 2 of the largest figures break away from the direct approach path. They used their incredible vertical speed to climb the adjacent, highest point of the mesa, a sheer granite spire that overlooked the terrace. They gained the summit in seconds. Corvin watched, paralyzed, as one of the figures crouched, its body vibrating with gathered energy. Then it launched itself. It was a leap of unimaginable power, covering a distance of perhaps 60 feet, intended not to land on the terrace, but directly on the rotors or the thin metal skin of the hovering helicopter. The pilot, sensing the anomaly or catching a brief glimpse of the hurtling shape, violently corrected the altitude, pitching the aircraft up. The unified variant missed, slamming into the granite wall with a sickening impact that should have liquefied any creature of flesh and bone before it plummeted into the deep, dark chasm below. Its tactic was clearly established. Target the vehicle, not the passengers. Disable the means of escape. Corvin shoved Jenna toward the winch. As they secured themselves to the line, the other creature on the spire launched a volley of fist-sized rocks, aimed with startling accuracy, striking the military transport helicopter's fuselage with dull, sharp thuds. The helicopter pulled away, climbing violently, dragging Corvin and Jenna swinging helplessly below. As the aircraft gained altitude, Corvin looked down toward the canyon floor, toward the mouth of the now sealed Sierra Black. Simultaneously, massive explosions erupted from the exterior of the mesa. The heavy steel door, the main ventilation shaft, and the drain access tunnel used by Stern all detonated in geysers of rock and debris. This was not the work of the prototypes. This was a systematic clinical cleanup coordinated from above. The Alpha Hunter was erasing all traces of the complex, ensuring that if any investigation followed, the only finding would be a collapsed mountain face. The military transport helicopter stabilized, and Corvin, now safely inside the cramped compartment, looked down one last time. His blood ran cold, solidifying the terrifying truth. He did not see one or two creatures. He saw dozens. They moved along the high ridges, among the fractured stones and sparse scrub. Previously invisible, they were now fully exposed, disseminating. They were not fighting the fire team. They were spreading out, moving with an astonishing, coordinated precision toward the desert floor and the distant, unseen flatlands. The realization hit Corvin with the force of a physical blow. They had not been fighting to survive an escape. They had been fighting to survive a release. The command structure sent them in, measured the efficiency of the response, and then engineered a massive, coordinated propagation event using the incoming military hardware as a diversion and a launch pad. On the military transport, helicopter's internal navigation display, secondary sensors designed for tracking large terrestrial wildlife, began flashing anomalous readings. High-speed, high-mass objects, showing extreme endurance and velocity, were moving away from the canyon. They were not hiding. They were scattering across the landscape, using the sheer expanse of the American West as their new hunting ground. The flight back to the secure military base was a sensory blur. Corvin sat strapped into the cramped, rattling space of the military transport helicopter, but he no longer felt safe. The smell of gun oil and jet fuel in the cabin was replaced in his mind by the lingering, sharp scent of ozone, blood, and hot metal from the encounter. His 10 years as an analyst, built on the solid bedrock of logic and observable facts, had been vaporized in the darkness of Sierra Black. His mind was permanently recalibrated, searching not for logic, but for hidden, predatory motion in every shadow. He finally understood the true horror of the unified variant. The agency had not created monsters for simple killing. They had created the perfect adaptive intelligence agents, capable of independent strategic action without the flawed interference of human emotion or morality. They were perfect, self-optimizing killers who, upon their release, had immediately started to evolve past their original programming. The end of rationalism had arrived. Corvin, the dedicated pragmatist, now understood that the known world was nothing more than a thin, civilized membrane stretched over a profound, engineered madness. The horror was not that they existed. It was that they were demonstrably evolving at a rate that surpassed human comprehension. He reviewed the facts: the evacuation order, the military transport helicopter's arrival, the deliberate destruction of the bunker. This was not a rescue mission. It was the Alpha Hunters' planned distribution network. The leadership had obtained exactly what they wanted: live, proven, fully adaptive samples dispersed into the real world for the final, ultimate phase of the test. Corvin stared out the window. Below them, the familiar, comforting quilt of Americana unfolded. Vast, ordered farmlands, small, tranquil highways, isolated ranch houses baking in the 90-degree heat. The contrast was the final, devastating stroke of dread. The terror was already among those peaceful scenes, cloaked in the shadows, moving faster than any vehicle. The helicopter shuddered, dropping rapidly toward the concrete expanse of the secluded base. As the landing gear touched down, Corvin slowly unbuckled his harness, his movements stiff and mechanical. He was the sole living witness to the birth of a new, horrifying form of life, one that was smarter, faster, and more ruthless than anything in human history. He stepped out onto the tarmac, blinking in the bright sunlight, the dry, familiar military base a parody of safety. He watched as a routine military patrol vehicle, lights flashing gently, prepared to roll out on a perimeter scan. But the military transport helicopter's onboard tactical sensors, still active from the mission, flashed on the pilot's unused console screen. The system registered 12 high-velocity, high-mass targets. They were not clustered near the landing zone. Moving with an unnervingly coordinated, flawless tactical movement, the unified variants had already bypassed the remote military screening post. They were not interested in the base. They were heading, with purpose, toward the faint, rising column of smoke Corvin knew marked the nearest populated settlement several dozen miles away. Project Gargoyle 12 was no longer a secret protocol. It had become a new, living law spreading silently across the landscape, guided by an optimized, perfect malice.